Welcome to Discover You, an inspiring podcast exploring cutting-edge solutions to our everyday psychological challenges. We explore complex mental health issues and talk to professionals, experts, and renowned authorities at the forefront of transformative healing. Our mission is to educate and destigmatize, and to ultimately view mental health as a proactive quest for optimized living and equilibrium, rather than mere crisis intervention. Welcome to another exciting episode of the Discover You podcast, in which we seek to illuminate and destigmatize various mental health conditions, and we bring to you the newest, innovative, cutting-edge modalities of treatment, which leads us to today's topic, neurobiofeedback. And this is one of particular excitement and interest to me personally and to our organization, Montare, as this is something that we provide, and this is something that we see so much efficacy and successful healing that emerges from it. So I am super stoked to introduce our guest today, Bill Scott, who is a leader and a pioneer in the neurobiofeedback space. And I'd like to introduce him by giving you a little bit about his bio, and then we can jump right into this conversation with Bill. Bill is the CEO of BrainPaint, which is a EEG biofeedback equipment training and support company with clinics in every major city in the US. Bill has also created research designs and training programs for International Space Station, SpaceX Lunar, and Mars mission astronauts. While serving his appointment at the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute, he published a study that is slowly changing the face of addiction treatment by nearly doubling success survival rates. He's routinely a featured expert on the History Channel, Discovery Science, and he's also published a chapter in the book Neurobiofeedback, The First 50 Years and the Elegant Solution. So Bill, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us today. It is an honor and a privilege to introduce you, and we can't wait to get started.
Thank you, JD. That was a nice introduction. I've heard very good things about you. It's nice to have you live here with us.
Thank you. Can't believe everything you heard, but hopefully only good stuff. Joe Lieberman was a senator of Connecticut, was a neighbor of mine. And he was once introduced, and he gets up there and he says, this is such a beautiful flowery introduction. He says, I wish my parents could have been here. My dad would have been so proud, and my mom would have even believed it, So the question, I guess, what we can just jump into is neurobiofeedback. For all our viewers and for all our listeners out there who are not familiar with what exactly is neurofeedback, what does it achieve, what does it accomplish, who is it meant for, who is the ideal demographic, and what's the history? How did it come into existence? Some of the greatest things came about via accident or through some, research institute of decades of research. How did neurofeedback come into existence?
Very good. Well, let me start with the latter question first. It actually began in UCLA's Neuropsychiatric Institute in 1969. A man by the name of Barry Sturman was doing some research with cats. They were seeing if they gave cats information where they put sensors on their brain and read this sensory motor brainwave rhythm. It's a brainwave that's related to the state that cats are in when they're ready for action. And they're getting ready to pounce on a little toy or something, and they're sitting there very still and their tail is twitching. It's called the sensory motor rhythm. They're prepared for action. And he rewarded that brainwave in this group of cats and found that they could all increase that particular brainwave. And they thought, well, that was interesting. And then NASA ended up needing a batch of cats to test some fuel where some astronauts were having hallucinations, and they thought it might be the methyl hydrazine gas was causing seizures. And so they got this group of cats from UCLA and they tested the gas on them. And the cats that ended up having done the neurofeedback, they seemed immune to the toxic effects of that poison, essentially, where the other cats had seizures and or died. And so the researchers thought, well, what's up with these cats? Why are they super cats? And they found out that they were in Barry Sturman's lab, and then Barry went on to replicate that study as well. And that was sort of how our field began. Then they started doing it with people with seizure disorders and found that they reduced seizures by 67%. And that was the beginning of our field. And then others found that there were different brain waves you could train for some very different effects. I got into the field many years later. I was working on an Indian reservation in northern Minnesota, the Boys Fort Reservation, and I was directing a chemical dependency program. We were doing over 160 interventions in over about a 2-year period, and referring people to nearly every treatment center in the state of Minnesota, and having virtually no success. 60% would leave treatment against medical advice without finishing it, whether it was a Native American specific program or not. And I was going to funerals about every other week as well. And it just things weren't working out so well. And I'd read, somebody put on my chair 3 research papers by a man by the name of Dr. Eugene Peniston, who claimed to have an 80% success rate, 80% success rate in these 3 studies with populations very similar to mine, which were Native Americans, or I should say Vietnam veterans with alcoholism. And I just threw the papers in the trash. I thought, oh, this is the type of follow-up where they just send out questionnaires to everyone who was in the study, and they do their statistics based on those that they get back. That always gives you an 80% success rate. And I didn't pay much attention to it. And then a few weeks later, a medicine man came into town and said he had this vision, and he had an eagle feather for me, and said, you're going to need this because you're going to be wiring people up to computers. You're going to be doing this kind of face-changing work with the field of addiction, and you're going to need this eagle feather for power. Vern Adams was his name. And so he gave me the eagle feather, which is one of the highest honors in that particular tradition. I just thought, wow, he's, too young to be a medicine man. What could he know? He was just in his early to mid 20s at the time. And then shortly thereafter, I got a call from someone who said, hey, there's a program that's opened up that's offering EEG biofeedback. Why don't we refer so-and-so to it, a client we were both working with? And I said, I have nothing to lose. Why not? We sent this individual to the program. He had many previous treatments, or she, had many previous treatments before that, and would also leave quite early and things of that nature. But about 2 weeks in, she was still there and was a model member of the treatment program. And I thought, well, I'll see how good this stuff works. And I sent them 2 additional people who had real severe antisocial personality disorders. And we were quite impressed that they were participating in the program versus sort of tearing it to shreds, essentially. And after that, it was like, oh my God, this is incredible. And I started referring a lot of people to the program, and we had 100% treatment completion, not a single individual left prior to their completion of the treatment program. We tracked them for about 1.5 years. And after that, I was like, oh my goodness, I need to do this in a larger fashion. And so I came to California with the intentions of hooking up with UCLA and conducting a randomized controlled trial on polysubstance abusers. The original work prior to that was just with alcoholics. And I'd also read some other research where those original protocols didn't work for alcoholism. They didn't work. They worked great for that, but they didn't work very well for polysubstance abusers. It was a 500 subject failed study in the Kansas prison system. my colleague David Kaiser and I, read all the research that was previously published, and we're looking at, well, what could address these issues that were more sort of physiologic in nature, that people with methamphetamine and cocaine and whatnot stimulants were abusing. And we came across a protocol that we finished we put together a research design. We tested it with a polysubstance abusing population because they have lots of comorbidities, anxiety, depression, traumatic brain injury. And we ended up replicating those earlier results. We ended up with a 77% success rate. In 2005, we published that study. And then after that, we realized, oh my God, we really have to make this more accessible to people, where our field had been training people how to build a car, essentially, in order to drive one. And when I met my wife, who came from Silicon Valley, who said, that's not what you do. You build something that's very user-friendly, and you automate everything you can possibly automate, and you remove the human error components of the work as much as possible. And that's where BrainPaint came from.
That is spectacular. That is really, really incredible to hear. So many follow-up questions that come to mind. For starters, so this is an amazing thing. This is a trial that occurred with cats, and then it kind of evolved into a very high efficacy modality of treatment for addiction, for chemical dependency. How does it work? How does it help? Does it deal with the mental health? Is it just the chemical dependency? And now fast forward 2021, what are the consistent rates of sobriety, of success, depending on how you measure it, of course, with neurobiofeedback?
Right. So we'll start with what it is first. It's our brain has, we have a heart wave. When you put sensors on our heart, we can see how our heart is beating. There's electrical waves that it produces. We also have electrical waves in our brain that are called brain waves. And the training procedure is actually very, very easy. In that when you give any system like our brain that has 3 or more parts that are influencing each other, you give them feedback on any variable, in this case EEG, that's related to functionality, our brain automatically improves that functionality. And a perfect example of that is if you were to stand on a slippery board on a slippery hill for 3 hours, with sensors, your eyes and your inner ear, where your inner ear kind of detects balance and your orientation. Your eyes can see the horizon. With that feedback, your brain will, within 3 hours, automatically self-regulate. It'll automatically develop the ability to balance on something as foolish as standing on a slippery board on a slippery hill. It'll do that with everything you give it feedback on. All you have to do to train our brain to work better is you have to have an assessment tool, which BrainPaint now automates, that looks at to what extent is your brain underactivated. So one way that Montare is looking at this is that there is a continuous performance test we call a brain print that people will play, where they complete this continuous performance test, and we look at, does their brain appear to be slow and inattentive, or fast and impulsive? And they were making all these errors, and or to what extent does the thing that's most detracting from the quality of their life relate to events in the external world? So that initial assessment that happens on day one gets at, well, what brainwave training strategy is likely to yield the quickest and fastest results? And then the feedback process is very simple. We put sensors on their head, and we have them look at a screen. And when their brain is producing these more desirable brainwaves, there's this graph on the screen that moves in this downward direction. And when undesirable states are happening, this graph moves in this upward direction. And there's also auditory sounds that happen as well. When they're moving into a more ideal state, more sounds happen. And they tend to be more like lower in pitch, but more of them happen. When they start moving into less ideal states, the sounds start cracking up, like almost like a speaker. So equipment is set up very much kind of like a Geiger counter. If you're kind of looking for, metal or something like that, or metal detectors, and you're getting closer to the source, more sounds happen. And that teaches their brain how to balance more in these states that are related to feeling better and these more optimum levels of arousal. Some of the training is done with eyes open, and some of it's done with their eyes closed.
Fascinating. And this is obviously a non-invasive neurological intervention. Would the practitioner or the facilitator need to have a clinical background to facilitate?
They need to be. I'm sorry. Yes, the person conducting the sessions at least needs to be supervised by a licensed therapist. That there are a lot of dynamics that come into play that are very complex if a licensed therapist is not supervising the work, essentially. But when that's in place, particularly in institutions, in nearly all of our institutions, we have technicians who are conducting the sessions, and we have therapists who are supervising them. And so if there was ever any concerns, they would go to the supervisor and go, so-and-so has been anxious in their first session. And the supervisor goes, yes. And so-and-so is anxious in everything, in every session, every group, every individual. That's why they're doing neurofeedback, and that's why they're in our treatment program. So we shouldn't expect them to feel wonderful the moment we put sensors on their head. And so they're all supervised, but our providers outside of institutions are all licensed mental health practitioners and psychiatrists and things of that nature.
That's very neat. And at one point, because the beginning of all this research and the beginning of this whole initiative really dates back to what you were mentioning. I believe you mentioned reference 1969. At what point did this become a modality and a platform for addiction treatment?
Yeah, pretty much. Eugene Peniston's original studies were the beginning of that. There were there were randomized controlled trials. There were just very small numbers of subjects. There were only like 10, 20 in each group, where there was an experimental and a control group. So there were very small numbers. But after we published the 2005 UCLA study, after that is where other a lot, not just with addiction, but with other mental health professionals and universities have been replicating it with like physicians' performance and to improve surgical skills, to help radiologists and things of that nature. But I think that particular model and our particular methodology and BrainPaint itself has been really helpful at helping out replications, because we remove increasingly more room for human error. And that's a big problem with research designs. If you're using a technology that's too complicated for the research associates to learn in their short windows of 3 to 9 months rotations, you're going to have trouble replicating results. So BrainPaint's been used in a number of these studies as well, which is helping successfully replicate that work.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So just for folks who might not have had the experience of doing any neurobiofeedback, a typical session, what will it look like? Is there conversing? Is there content that is specific to the client's background, symptoms, drug of choice that are being discussed? Or is it, simply looking at the screen? Well, why don't you give us a sort of a tangible portrayal of how that looks?
Yeah. So the very first session would be the clinician would be asking the clients a bunch of questions about things like, do you snore? Do you have nightmares? Do you wake up after you've fallen asleep? They'll be asking them a bunch of questions like that, and or completing what's called a continuous performance test, where there's a signal on the screen. They're looking at this thing, and they click a button with their right thumb if they see an R, and a button with the left thumb if they see an L, while they're recording their brain waves. And so that's the initial session. It takes about maybe 45 minutes. as an assessment. And then all subsequent sessions to that, they come in and the client would look at the screen. They'd be with the eyes open training, they'd be looking to see if there's this graph that has any blue in it. And if there is, they would click the right mouse button to prevent it from turning all blue for as long as they can. Would all begin with a discussion, though, typically, too. Probably one of the most valuable things to know is that people who experience many negative emotions on a daily basis will always feel negative emotions during their session. It's not like we put sensors on their head and you zap them into an unconscious state where they're not feeling anything. It's not like electroshock therapy at all. It's a training experience that's similar to the way that you learn to ride a bike. So when they're looking at their brain waves in the first session, virtually nothing will happen at all in the first session. In fact, a lot of times 50% of your population will start out with just a 7-minute protocol the first day to ease them into the process. It gives them this distraction exercise and things like that, but ultimately, though, the clinician will say, if you feel a lot of negative emotions many times a day, if that happens during this initial session, that's never a problem. It's just what would happen whether we had your sensors plugged in or not, because you experience that many times a day. And because addicts quite frequently are very much, when it comes to feelings, they're often in early recovery. They're often very much tuned into sensation and sort of looking for a sensation often, like, oh, you're going to put these wires on my head and I'm going to feel these amazing feelings. Well, between 5 and 8 of these, what seems to happen is they're feeling amazing feelings outside of sessions, in that the states where when, let's say, JD, you walk by someone and you had a frown because you had a headache or something like that in your face. Most addicts in early recovery, even after just traditional treatments for years, would go, oh, JD doesn't like me. And it's because of what I said in group last week. And I have to be really, really nice to him now so he likes me again. Their heads make up all these stories. But after about 5 to 8 of these sessions, that reduces significantly. And what would often happen if you're had a frown in your face, you had a bunch of files in your arms, and you're going through a door. So I go, oh, hey, all right, JD, let me get the door for you. They'd be more inclined to help you out in that regard. And so that is how they end up feeling better, and that's very fast. But during the feedback itself, it's this accumulative thing. Often with this eyes closed work that about 70% of your clients would be receiving, they will, after about the 3rd to 5th session, they'll start feeling really good during them. But they should not be expecting that right from the get-go. If they have lots of anxiety and they're very reactive, it's quite natural that would happen. In the similar way, if you ever have practiced snowboarding like I did, my first day, I spent the whole day on my butt, but I slept on it that night. And the next day when I got up and got on the slopes, it felt like I had been practicing in my sleep. And it's the same, because it's the exact same type of learning that our brain goes through. It's just developmental learning that happens. It's not like this event. Yeah.
Fascinating. So I'd love to segue into the next portion of the podcast, and that would be a series of rapid fire questions that people are very keen and very interested in knowing about neurobiofeedback. So just a number of questions with the briefest of answers, even though obviously every question does contain depth, and it's probably going to be a bit of a challenge to comprehensively tackle it, but we'll do what we can within the time limitations that we have. First and foremost, the neurobiofeedback. Ideal demographic, ideal target. Is it for somebody who's resisting treatment, or is it even for somebody who is engaging in cognitive behavioral therapy and attending a spiritual program, AA? Is there an ideal target?
Not really, no. If you had to conserve resources, let's say you just had one machine and a 40-bed facility or something like that. In a case like that, you might consider, methamphetamine users or women with infant children, populations who are most apt to leave, who statistically we know tend to leave treatment against medical advice much more quickly. You can pretty much eliminate that if you had to conserve resources. But other than that, or I would say if you had anyone, again, if you had to conserve resources and you had somebody with a significant head trauma as well, doesn't matter how many years it's been, if they've lost use of limbs and things of that nature, or eyesight, or they can't speak well and things of that nature, that's something they're not going to get anywhere besides neurofeedback. If it's been over a year and a half, they've plateaued, period. And all traditional science would have for them is a pamphlet, how to cope with your symptoms for the rest of your life. You hook them up to neurofeedback, usually within 3 sessions. There's clear improvements. If they were seeing an occupational therapist or a physical therapist or something like that, they'll be blown away by these near instantaneous results over a week or two. Yeah.
Incredible. Do people have to go back for a tune-up after a couple of years? For example, transcranial magnetic stimulation, it's recommended to come in perhaps after 18 to 24 months, or is this something that you do once in a lifetime and it will hopefully last forever?
No, it appears to last forever. I've been in the field now for 27 years, and there's been a few 10-year follow-ups. The difference between this is our TMS or TMS is called an end training device. So it puts your brain in a state, kind of like a drug. If you take a drug, it puts your brain in a state. It doesn't teach your brain how to access those states. And around 8 sessions appears to be a sweet spot where it's actually whatever gains you've made, if you do 5 sessions beyond that point, whatever gains you made, those gains are likely to remain permanent. Now, that's just an anecdotal observation. We really need some funding for some dosage research, and I have a research design all ready to go to determine. But if somebody just does maybe, let's say 3 to 5 sessions, and now their nightmares have improved but not gone away, and their attention is a little bit better. They're not forgetting people's names or forgetting what they went into a room for. If they just did between 3 and 5 sessions, they would usually lose, and they stopped. They would usually lose all of those gains that they had made. But if they've done whatever gains they made after 5,
that's important to note. So they would lose gains if they terminated the treatment prematurely. You have to finish off. And what does an average treatment plan look like? 20, 30 sessions?
It varies. If somebody just has one issue, for example, like ADHD, and they don't have any other emotional distress or other learning disabilities and things of that nature, then typically, about 10 to 20 sessions would typically take care of that. When people have multiple issues where they have both cognitive deficits, like a TBI or ADHD, and they have post-traumatic stress disorder and significant insecurities and things of that nature, then we might be looking at around 40 sessions. So we would typically start by working on, you can think of it as the hardware first, on the cognitive issues with the eyes open only work, and then maybe the last 20 sessions or I'd say 10 to 20 sessions could be with the alpha theta work that would help with the insecurities and the PTSD and things of that nature. But if you had somebody with a massive head injury who, let's say, is requiring 24-hour care and things of that nature, and they were to do a series of, maybe 60 sessions, it's quite likely over that course, they could get from maybe needing 24-hour care to living semi-independently or something like that in 60 sessions. And maybe over the course of 300 sessions might be able to live semi-independent or maybe completely independent in some cases. So that's depending on the severity.
So it's a highly customized platform, which is truly remarkable. And for the just the closing statistic for everybody listening and plugged in today, what is the historical data of efficacy for chemical dependency for folks who subscribe to the neurobiofeedback treatment? In one line, what is the
Yeah, between 77 and 85% efficacy.
That's amazing. So for everybody listening, I want to encourage all of you who might know of somebody struggling with chemical dependency, who's failed, who's relapsed, to entertain neurobiofeedback and to explore Bill's work at brainpaint.com and to really seek this incredible modality of treatment, which has such encouraging statistics and data. And I want to thank you, Bill, for joining us today and for sharing the wisdom and for sharing your experience. And it's a very complex topic, and there's so much more, and I could spend hours just asking and answering. But hopefully what this is really going to be for all those out there listening is the beginning of a conversation and the beginning of a research and the beginning of a quest to find out more about it and to really allow this to help the maximum amount of people possible. And if that will have been accomplished as a result of our conversation, if even one person who had not known about this or been plugged in utilizes it and it helps them get their life back together, then it will have been worth it. We save the world one life at a time. So thank you so much, Bill, and it's been a real pleasure. And with that, we will conclude this really enlightening episode of the Discover You podcast, exploring neuro and biofeedback. Thank you. Any closing remarks, Bill?
No, JD, I'd just like to say it's been an honor working with your organization. Everyone I've spoken with takes it very, very seriously. And I'm just very impressed with your organization and your staff as well. You have very good pickers and you attract very good people. But thank you.
Sure. Appreciate it. Very, very well done. Have a wonderful day, Bill, and thank you all for plugging in to this important episode of the Discover You podcast. Have a wonderful rest of your day.